A $2,000 drone just forced a billion-dollar warship to burn through $4 million in missiles. That math doesn't work. And it's happening right now in the Red Sea. The deadliest threats to U.S. Navy supply ships aren't submarines lurking in the deep. They're not carrier-killer missiles screaming across the horizon. The most dangerous attacks on America's logistics fleet, the ships that fuel, feed, and arm every carrier group, come from weapons you could buy with a credit card. We've ranked the top 5 attack methods from most to least effective. The results will rewrite everything you thought you knew about modern naval warfare. Because when a supply ship goes down, the entire battle group starves in days. And the threats exploiting that vulnerability? They're cheaper, stealthier, and far more insidious than Hollywood ever showed you. Here's what the Pentagon doesn't advertise. Every carrier strike group, those floating cities of American power projection, runs on a hidden lifeline. Supply ships, not the sexy stuff. No fighter jets, no Tomahawk missiles, no billion-dollar radars, just fuel, food, ammunition, and parts. Without them, a supercarrier becomes a 100,000-ton paperweight in 72 hours. These vessels, oilers, ammunition ships, fast combat support ships, operate in the shadow of their more famous cousins. They don't make the news until they're attacked, and most people assume they're easy prey. Lumbering targets stuffed with jet fuel and high explosives, defended by, what, a few machine guns? That assumption just cost you the war. Because here's the truth. Modern conflicts aren't won by sinking aircraft carriers. They're won by strangling the logistics chain that keeps carriers operational. Cut the fuel supply, and those F-35s become lawn ornaments. Deplete the ammo, and the VLS cells sit empty while the enemy advances. Naval theorists have known this for centuries. In World War II, German U-boats nearly starved Britain by hunting merchant convoys. But back then, the threat model was simple. Submarines firing torpedoes. Big weapons, big platforms, predictable tactics. Today, the threat landscape has fractured into something far more dangerous. Ask yourself, what's scarier? A $100 million submarine that takes years to build, crews of trained specialists, and shows up on sonar arrays, or $1,000, $2,000 drones launched from pickup trucks controlled by teenagers with joysticks, swarming your defenses until something gets through. The U.S. Navy spent decades perfecting defenses against the first threat. Torpedo countermeasures, anti-submarine warfare, acoustic signatures, attack submarines hunting enemy subs. Billions invested, generations of doctrine. And then asymmetric warfare showed up with a different rulebook. The Red Sea, 2024. Houthi rebels, not a superpower, not even a legitimate navy, forced the most advanced fleet on Earth into a defensive crouch. Constant harassment, drones and anti-ship missiles, crude by Western standards, launched in waves, some intercepted, some not. And every successful intercept burned through million-dollar interceptor missiles. Do that math over months, over years. This is where the assumptions collapse, where the old playbook, torpedoes, heavyweight missiles, stealthy submarines, gets upended by swarms of cheap, expendable munitions piloted by algorithms. So what are the real threats? Which attack methods actually work against U.S. Navy supply ships in 2026? Could a $1,000 drone honestly be more lethal than a $10 million torpedo? The ranking isn't what you expect. Number 5 on the list, the method currently rewriting naval doctrine in real time. Low-cost drones and anti-ship missiles. Not because they're individually deadly, because they're individually cheap. A Houthi drone costs maybe $2,000 to assemble. An Iranian anti-ship missile, perhaps $20,000. Compare that to the SM-2 missile used to shoot them down, $2.4 million per shot. The SM-6, even better against maneuvering threats, north of $4 million. This is the cost imbalance crisis. And it's not theoretical. Red Sea mariners faced it firsthand. Anonymous crew accounts describe the psychological toll. Radar alarms screaming, incoming contacts, the automated defenses lighting up. And then the mental arithmetic. How many missiles left? How many more attacks tonight? One mariner put it bluntly, a burst of .50 caliber might not stop a drone like a speedboat, but it's the difference between defense and sinking. Translation: when the expensive interceptors run out, you're down to bullets. The Houthis understood this instinctively. They don't need to sink ships, though they've damaged several. They just need to force the US Navy to spend millions per engagement, again and again, until the magazines run dry or the logistics of resupply become untenable. It's economic attrition. The rebels lose drones. America loses fiscal sustainability. Now scale that to a peer conflict. China holds 2,944 vertical launch system cells across its destroyers in the Western Pacific. The U.S. 7th Fleet, 1,344 cells. That's not a skirmish imbalance. That's a saturation advantage designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer volume. Imagine this scenario: a supply convoy steaming toward a carrier group operating near the second island chain. Chinese forces don't send their best anti-ship missiles first. They send waves of cheap drones and dated rockets, expendable munitions designed to bait out the defender's magazine depth. By the time the actual heavyweight missiles arrive, the supply ships have burned through half their SM-6 inventory, their ESSM stocks depleted, VLS cells emptied, and the convoy hasn't even reached the combat zone yet. This is the nightmare the Pentagon wargames in classified briefings. Not one dramatic strike that sinks a ship. A rolling campaign of attrition where the math simply doesn't add up. Where defending costs more than attacking, and the attacker has deeper pockets, or at least more expendable munitions. Brian Clark, a naval analyst and former Navy officer, framed it this way: autonomous tech allows pre-programmed navigation even under jamming, like naval mines. He's talking about the evolution of these cheap threats. They're not just remote-controlled anymore. They're autonomous. Fire and forget. Jam the GPS? Doesn't matter. They navigate by pre-programmed waypoints, visual recognition, even dead reckoning. You can't spoof what doesn't need a signal. The implication: even more effective, even harder to stop, even cheaper to mass produce. But wait, if these threats are so overwhelming, how do billion-dollar warships survive at all? How exactly does the US Navy stop the swarm? The answer sits on the deck of every supply ship and destroyer, a 6-barreled Gatling gun that sounds like a chainsaw tearing through sheet metal. The Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, CIWS, pronounced CIWS. It fires 20mm rounds at 4,500 per minute. Effective range, 1 mile. Optimal kill zone, inside 3,000 yards. The system is fully automated. It detects, tracks, engages, and destroys without human input. When an incoming missile or drone crosses the threshold, CIWS creates a literal wall of tungsten penetrator rounds in its path. Most threats disintegrate before they know what hit them. This is the last line of defense. The insurance policy when everything else fails. And it works. In the Red Sea engagements, SICE successfully shredded multiple drones that slipped through the outer defensive layers. One burst, one kill. The problem? This has a minimum range gap. Too close, and the gun can't depress low enough. That's where the 50 caliber machine guns come in. Manual operation, slower rate of fire, but they cover the final 100 yards where even CIWS goes blind. So picture the defensive envelope. Long-range intercepts by SM-6 missiles taking out threats at 200+ miles. Mid-range kills by ESSM missiles inside 30 miles. Close-range CIWS shredding anything inside 1 mile. And if something gets past all that, sailors with Ma Deuces hosing down the final approach. Layered, redundant, expensive. The Aegis missile system handles the long and mid-range work. It's the gold standard of naval air defense. A radar so powerful it tracks hundreds of contacts simultaneously. A fire control system so fast it can ripple fire interceptors in seconds. The SM-6 missile it launches doesn't just hit aircraft. It takes out ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, even surface ships at extended range. It's a technological marvel, and it's bleeding the Navy dry against $2,000 drones. Here's the cruel math. An SM-6 costs over $4 million. A Houthi drone costs 0.5% of that. If the rebels launch 20 drones in a coordinated swarm, and the Navy shoots down 19, they still spent $76 million to stop $40,000 worth of threats. The 20th drone? Maybe it gets through, maybe it doesn't, but the economic damage is already done. This is why Brian Clark's analysis hits so hard. When he says unmanned munitions function like naval mines, autonomous, unjammable, pre-programmed, he's describing a future where the cost imbalance gets worse. Now imagine a Pacific scenario, a Chinese anti-access campaign designed to isolate US carrier groups by interdicting their supply lines. Intelligence estimates suggest China could launch massed salvos, not tens but hundreds, of drones, missiles, and unmanned surface vehicles simultaneously. The US task force has maybe 1,344 VLS cells total across all its destroyers and cruisers in theater. China has 2,944, just among its Type 052D destroyers alone. 32 of those ships, each packing 64 cells. If even a fraction of those cells carry cheap, autonomous munitions designed to bait out US defenses before the real heavyweight anti-ship missiles arrive, the supply ships run out of interceptors before China runs out of targets. Defenses work. They're impressive. They save lives daily. But impressive doesn't mean sustainable. So if the problem is ammunition expenditure, if the cost curve is unsolvable with traditional missiles and guns, what's the answer? Retreat? Escort every supply run with half the fleet? Or maybe, turn the hunted into hunters? Distributed lethality. Two words that rewrote US naval strategy. The concept is simple. Stop treating supply ships like helpless logistics platforms. Arm them. Turn every auxiliary vessel, every oiler, every ammunition ship into an offensive problem the enemy must solve. If a Chinese destroyer wants to attack a US supply convoy, it now faces a dilemma. That unarmed oiler might be carrying Tomahawk cruise missiles and containerized launchers. That ammunition ship could have anti-ship missiles tucked between the pallets of bombs. Suddenly, targeting isn't simple. Suddenly, every contact on radar is a potential threat. Surface warfare officers describe the shift in stark terms: shift burden to adversaries by arming every platform. This is the payloads over platforms doctrine. Instead of building more billion-dollar warships, which take years and drain budgets, the Navy started bolting weapons onto existing hulls. Literal combat ships got anti-ship missiles. Destroyers got new weapons in place of old systems. And yes, even supply ships got offensive punch. The strategic brilliance: it dilutes enemy intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance efforts. ISR, the ability to track and prioritize targets, is finite. If the adversary has to monitor and potentially target every auxiliary ship, every transport, every supposedly benign platform, their ISR gets stretched thin. Mistakes happen. Real combat ships slip through because analysts wasted effort tracking a supply vessel that turned out to be a missile truck. This happened in war games. US forces equipped auxiliary ships with long-range strike weapons, then inserted them into simulated Pacific conflicts. Enemy forces, programmed to prioritize capital ships and known combatants, initially ignored the auxiliaries. Then the auxiliaries started shooting. The simulated enemy had to rewrite targeting priorities mid-battle. Too late. The distributed strike had already blunted their offensive. Now consider the unmanned surface munitions being procured through the Defense Innovation Unit. These aren't ships. They're autonomous speedboat-sized explosives, pre-programmed to navigate toward target coordinates like floating mines. Brian Clark noted their advantage. Even under electronic warfare conditions, where GPS is jammed and comms are degraded, these munitions continue toward their targets. Autonomy doesn't care about jamming. Launch 100 from a supply ship during a transit. They scatter, navigate independently, and converge on enemy surface action groups or shore installations. The supply ship itself might be 200 miles away when they hit. The enemy doesn't just face the weapons. They face the psychological burden of knowing every platform is potentially lethal. That's the distributed lethality endgame: exhaustion through uncertainty. Pair this with directed energy weapons, lasers that draw power straight from the ship's reactor, offering unlimited shots against drones as long as the power holds. Each engagement costs pennies in electricity instead of millions in missiles. The cost curve starts bending back in America's favor. But here's the catch: this arms race never ends. As the US adapts, adversaries adapt. New threats emerge, old ones evolve. The question isn't whether distributed lethality works. It does. The question is, what happens when the threats leapfrog again? What's the next nightmare the defense establishment hasn't solved yet? Short answer: nobody's entirely sure. The research documents low-cost drones, missile saturation, torpedo threats, and even close-in speedboat swarms. But there's a category conspicuously underexplored in public analysis: cyber attacks. Think about it. A supply ship is a floating network: navigation systems, engine controls, weapons safeties, comms with the carrier group, logistics databases tracking every pallet of ammunition, every gallon of fuel. All of it runs on code. What happens when that code becomes the battlefield? when the attack isn't a missile, but a payload injected through a compromised satellite uplink. When the weapon isn't explosive, it's information warfare that turns the ship's own systems into sabotage tools. Specifics remain classified or simply undetailed in open sources. But the potential is obvious. Redirect a supply ship into shallow water. Corrupt its navigation so it thinks it's miles from where it actually is. Lock down weapons systems during an engagement. Trigger false alarms that waste interceptor missiles on phantom threats. Or, worst case, detonate onboard ammunition remotely. The terrifying part? Cyber attacks scale infinitely at near zero marginal cost. One intrusion, replicated across a fleet's supply chain, could cripple logistics without firing a shot. This might be why, despite the public focus on drones and missiles, cyber attacks hover as the unspoken apex threat. Stealth, total. Cost, negligible. Disruption potential, catastrophic. Knowledge gap acknowledged. Meanwhile, the Navy races ahead on other fronts. Directed energy weapons are deploying fleet-wide by 2026, offering unlimited magazine depth against drone swarms. Long-range strike drones, procured through DIU, will extend the offensive reach of surface groups, turning supply ships into forward missile platforms without the vulnerability of manned aircraft. By 2027, unmanned surface munitions are expected to dominate sea denial operations. Autonomous systems that navigate without hunt without human control, and strike without warning. The timeline marches on, 2030 and beyond. The VLS cell imbalance worsens unless the US surges production. China continues building destroyers faster than America builds replacements. The cost math might tip permanently if interceptor costs don't drop. But here's the constant: human ingenuity. Every time one side develops an unbeatable weapon, the other side invents an unexpected counter. The torpedo gave us sonar, the missile gave us PSI-Ws, the drone swarm is giving us directed energy, and cyber intrusion? That'll give us something else. Quantum encrypted comms, maybe, AI-monitored network integrity, isolated systems that can't be accessed remotely, or maybe the answer is already here, classified, waiting for the conflict that forces its deployment. The battle for naval logistics is continuous. It's fought in code and steel, in budget meetings and storm-tossed convoys. The US Navy adapts because it has to. Supply ships no longer just supply. They strike, defend, deceive. But threats evolve too. The next vulnerability is always lurking, hidden in some underfunded analyst's report, waiting for an adversary to exploit. That's the reality of modern naval warfare. The fight never ends. The grocery run never gets safe. And the best defense is knowing the threat before the enemy does. So what do you think is coming next? What attack method will rewrite the playbook in 5 years? Share your insights below. And if you want to know how the Navy's next-generation autonomous fleet will change carrier operations entirely, that's coming next week. Subscribe so you don't miss it.